I'm going to now introduce our moderator, John Piha. John is a full professor at Carnegie Mellon University. He's addressed information networks from positions in industry, government, and academia. In government, he served at the Federal Communications Commission as chief technologist, in the White House as assistant deputy director of the Office of Science and Technology Policy, where he focused on telecommunications research, in the House Energy and Commerce Subcommittee, where he was responsible for telecom and e-commerce issues, and at USAID, where he helped launch and lead a U.S. government interagency program to assist developing countries with information infrastructure and industry. He has been chief technical officer for 3 high-tech companies and a member of the technical staff at SRI International, AT&T, Bell Laboratories, and Microsoft. Besides that, he's also done a whole bunch of other stuff too. And John will introduce the panel. We're not going to give full bios. The bios are in your handouts for this panel and on the website. So John, please.
Okay, thanks, David. I'm happy to be here with an amazing group. I would like, in fact, to take credit for this group, but I can't. This is David's fine work. But I'm happy to have been drafted as speaker and moderator. First, I want to let's frame this issue a little bit and define what we're talking about. The title of this was Encryption, Backdoors, Cybersecurity, and Privacy, which sounds like we were just, we couldn't decide what to talk about, so we had 4 topics. There really is one topic here. So there's just a lot going on in that title. I like Dave Crocker's comment this morning, because I make it myself, so it must be good, about security. I mean, this is really about security, but security means many, many, many things. And that confuses us. And there are different elements of it. So 2 of those elements in particular I want to pull out. One of them is that security may mean of protecting information in all sorts of ways from those we don't want to get it, which is also a privacy issue. And that's something we care about. We also care sometimes as a security issue about surveillance, about tracking down entities that are dangerous to us might also be an issue of security. And sometimes those things come into conflict, which is what this is about. This, to me, used to be a fascinating abstract issue. You got some of my past from David a minute ago as a professor. I've thought about this and written about this in government and places like the FCC and the White House. We thought about this as a problem that might happen to somebody else. There is an economic adage that a recession is when your neighbor loses his job, and a depression is when you lose your job. This is now an important issue. If anyone who's following the OPM hack of recent weeks. Happened in these government positions to go through the most invasive imaginable, investigation in order to get security clearances, had to reveal the embarrassing things I did in junior high school that I've been able to hide from my mother all these years. And now that's all out there. So now this has become a serious issue. And part of that, of course, makes me want to say, what can we do to better protect information? What could the organizations, both government and government contractors, have done? Are there ways that there are technology that would be better protection and avoid all vulnerabilities? Of course, it also makes me want to say, I want to know where my data went. Maybe it's the Chinese government, maybe it's somebody else. We're still waiting to find out. That's kind of a surveillance issue. I need agencies that are capable of finding that out. And the realization that I want technology to be vulnerable from a determined intelligence agency in another country, and I would also like intelligence agencies in my country to be able to track things down, leaves me a little confused. So this is what we'd like to talk about here. Let's see. I would also say this is going to come. This is an inherently interdisciplinary discussion. I hope we're going to hear a couple of sides of this. I am an engineer who has now spent a lot of time with policymakers. My engineering brethren, many of them like to believe that the policy is irrelevant, when in fact the laws and practices and policies and internet governance that we put in place have a lot to do with the incentives to protect that data, or not. The incentives to build in backdoors or not, and it is enormously important. But also, there are people in this town who like to think that the policies really make the decisions. I happen right now, for example, to be part of the Future Internet Architecture project. The NSF has pumped tens of millions of dollars into the question of what is after TCP/IP, and I am pleased to be a piece of that. And we have engineers sitting making seemingly obscure technical decisions about things like how do you do authentication, or in this case where encryption can be on or off, is the default on or is the default off? And these seem very technical, and yet they have enormous impact. So I hope we're both going to get a little technical discussion and a little policy discussion and a lot that goes in between. And now let me bring some speakers in who can help us get started. I guess Nick volunteered, so maybe I will start this way and move down. Our first speaker will be Nick Sullivan, who is the security engineering lead at Cloudflare and has previously worked at obscure technical organizations like Apple and Symantec that may also have thought a little about security too.
Right, thanks, John. So just maybe a little bit more about myself. I'm a technologist. I build and develop trust-enhancing technology, and that's been my focus for a while. At Apple, I helped develop iTunes, and iTunes was a revolutionary new way of getting music delivered over the internet. And one of the most important things that made iTunes successful was the fact that you could trust that the music that you were getting and the manner in which you were getting it was both secure and trusted. So at around the time that iTunes came out, there was the whole Napster debacle and eventual shutdown, and at the same time, various other organizations and open source software came up to try to deliver content to people in a sort of untrusted, unregulated way. And this led to a very bad situation for people who had gotten used to getting music online, but were instead flooded with malware and viruses and all these sort of things. So one of the most important things that helped Apple work with the businesses that were the content owners and content creators was cryptography and strong encryption. And the fact that Apple built this in made it so that they could build a trusted ecosystem and followed the direction that that the internet provided to people, which was access to content, access to technology, access to information easily and very simple and comfortable to use for the average person. 2 years ago, around the time of the Edward Snowden revelations, I left Apple to join an internet company called Cloudflare, whose vision was to provide trust for websites and the internet. And this sort of fit with my previous role at Apple, which was to take something that was potentially risky and potentially dangerous, which is browsing the web, and add trust where it could be added, and take the technologies of encryption, which I had studied in school and done a master's degree in, and apply it in a way where it could scalably help an entire industry. So the internet is and the web specifically has grown enormously and exponentially since the time that it's come around. It's no longer, say, 100,000 websites indexed on Yahoo or something like that. It's a multi-party, multidisciplinary, multi-stakeholder, multi-jurisdictional part of our everyday lives. And the technology that makes it up is owned, operated, and controlled by not only sort of large governance bodies like here, but small businesses who run and operate websites and provide internet services. So this is great, and it's grown, and it's been fantastic for enabling the world to access information. But along with that comes a lot of danger, and the internet was not designed purposefully with security completely baked in. It was something that was added along the way, and something that a lot of people from a lot of different places have contributed to help make it better. But there's no catch-all solution to securing the way that you surf the internet and to improve trust. So one of the projects that I took part in at Cloudflare since I joined was called Universal SSL. And one of the challenges that people have with websites, one of the very basic technologies you have to help ensure that you as a web visitor and you as a web property are secure is HTTPS, which the underlying technology is a protocol previously called SSL, has been standardized by the IETF as TLS. This has been around for almost 20 years, this technology. But it really transforms what was a communication between a person visiting a website and the 20 or up to 100 different hops in between. When you send a message to a website and it comes back to you, it goes through numerous different transformations, physical transformations through different media, whether wireless, wired, and through different circuits and computers along the way, routers, switches, proxies, and the like. And what SSL does is provide a way to make sure that you have confidentiality and authentication between the two endpoints. It doesn't. There's certain things it doesn't provide, but in any case, this is very difficult for a lot of people to set up operationally because you have to purchase a certificate from a certificate authority and know how to run a web server and install it and make sure it doesn't expire. And there were previously, and there still are, some sort of technical reasons why encrypting data is more expensive than not encrypting data. So what Universal SSL did was enable websites to, we engineered a solution to allow websites to use our free service, but yet gain SSL encryption on it. So the web is big and the internet is big, and it crosses everything. So as long as you can, the more you can do to reduce the threat surface, the better it is for people's privacy online. And that's something that I've been focusing on, is maintaining accessibility of information while improving trust.
Thank you. Next up, I'll just go down the line. We have Eric Berger, who is a computer science professor at Georgetown University, and in his spare time, a non-executive director of the Public Interest Registry.
Haha, this way you can't stop me. You can still kick me. So I want to focus on actually not the second half of the title, but the first half of the title of this session, the Maintaining Trust Online. I'm going to deviate a little bit off of encryption for a while, but trust me, I'm going to bring us back to encryption and security, but to give kind of a level setting here. Basically, as Nick pointed out, we need trust to be online. We need to trust that we're not going to be getting malware. We need to trust that the information we're getting is the information we're looking for. We need to trust when we give someone information that they're going to treat that information in the way that we expect them to. And so what I'm going to give an example of is a project that we just did a prototype of, just wrapped it up at Georgetown, where we were looking at HIV and AIDS patients in the Maryland, the district, and Virginia. And the problem that the public health authorities were having was, let's say someone lived in Maryland, worked in Virginia, and went through the district. And so they live in Maryland, and maybe they may or may not be known to the health authorities as having HIV, but they go to their doctor in Virginia because it's convenient. It's near their work, and so the doctor has records. Virginia now knows, hey, here's a person who's got HIV, and they buy their drugs, they get their medicine in the district. The people in Maryland are saying, hey, we've got this person, and we actually do, because this is an infectious disease. We need to know if they're infected. Are they getting treatment? Well, they don't know that because Virginia knows that. Then if they're getting treatment, are they taking care of themselves? Are they getting and taking their drugs? Well, they don't know that because that's information held in the district. So there's this need for everyone to share the information. Now, of course, no one wants to share that information because that's highly sensitive information. And so now when we get to the technology, is it good enough to encrypt the traffic? Because you can imagine we got the server at Georgetown that's connected to all these public health authorities, and they're sending us the information of people who are infected. Obviously, that has to be encrypted, but is that enough? Well, the first is that enough question I will hand up, and this lunatic sitting to my right, to your left, is one of the authors of this with some other lunatic, Risking It All, Unlocking the Back Doors to the Nation's Cybersecurity, produced by IEEE USA. So let's say we get all this information onto a server, but for all sorts of good reasons, we put a backdoor, not we, the vendor of the systems, put a backdoor into that system. And that could be used for finding, bad people that are doing bad stuff, but this happens to be HIV information, which we, as a public, probably don't want to have leaked out. So what can we do about it? Because, of course, as you can imagine, we encrypted everything out the wazoo. We put this machine literally in a vault. And by the way, we didn't have the combination. If it caught fire, it would have, burned itself out because it was in a vault. It was that secure. And so we're working on some things in two areas. One's called multi-party computation. So this is where Virginia has its information, the district has its information, Maryland has its information, and they cryptographically transform that information and basically share it amongst themselves. You look at the information, you have no idea what it is. The really cool thing is you don't even really know what the computation is doing, but the computation says, we've got a match or we don't. That's the only thing you know. In fact, you can set it up such that you don't even know who it is. You just know you need to go look somewhere. Another area of work that we're working on is called zero-knowledge computation. Used a lot, and the target was cloud computing, where I will scramble my program, and I will scramble my data. And I'll give you my scrambled program, which is a program. It runs. It takes the scrambled data, does what it does, and out comes a scrambled answer. The person doing the computation has no idea what the computation was. They look at the source code and they go, wow, this is just scrambled code. It's still code. It still runs. But what's the, sort of why are we looking at that kind of stuff? It's because the idea is that we need to move from sort of the Fort Knox security model of we're going to have all this high-grade encryption, we're going to have trusted personnel, we're only going to look at something when we have the permission to look at it, to even if you did look at it, you'd have no idea what you're looking at. And the idea is that this gives people the confidence to sort of give up their data. And you might ask, well, boy, that sounds pretty esoteric, and I'm not infected with HIV. What do we care? Even though, like as John said, sometimes you think you don't care, and it turns out you do. Well, let's look at the libraries. American Library Association has done a lot of campaigning over the past decade over the Patriot Act, particularly Section 215. And if you think about it, 214 is the one you hear about a lot in the news, 215 a little bit as well. 215 is the one where the government can request records about physical stuff, like books. By the way, the status is not clear. It may be that with the last round of the Freedom Act, it might not have been renewed. That's not clear, but it does give us kind of a morality tale, a real what-if situation, because it certainly was the law for the past 10 years. So like me. So I've read some books on psychological disorders. I watch Sense8 on Netflix, and I read books on alternative World War II, alternative histories. So what kind of profile does that give me? Or an example I actually have in one of my patent disclosures, if I Google HIV, does that mean I'm a researcher looking for information? Does that mean I have HIV? Or in the Facebook sense, do I like HIV? There's a lot of worries about what it means to have all this information at our fingertips. So I saw a lot of people shaking their head. Yeah, that would be bad. So listening to the American Library Association people, a lot of people go, wow, that's great that you're protecting our stuff. In fact, they're taking sort of the 1980s approach to what I've been talking about in terms of our work in multi-party computation and zero knowledge, which is when you borrow a library book, they'll only keep that information as long as you return the book. The moment you return the book, they tear it up, they delete the record, whatever. So they don't have it, you can't get it. What's the number one thing people ask at their library? Wow, when I get a book from Amazon or I get a movie on Netflix, they give me suggestions of what I want to, this is the book you're going to read. Can't you do that for me too? And so again, as John pointed out, this is not a black or white. We should do something or we shouldn't do something. There are times where we want to have this information. And as consumers, it's not just we all agree we want to catch terrorists. As well, no, actually, I want you to track me a little bit. So as long as we can figure out how to deliver both, and as long as people are confident with where their data goes when they want it to go, people keep using the internet and we get more and more and more connected. Thanks a lot.
Thank you. Next up, Bobby Flame is a special agent with the Federal Bureau of Investigation and a big player in lots of internet issues. In the right place.
Thank you very much. Bobby Flame, I work for the part of the FBI that's called the Operational Technology Division down in Quantico. And the Operational Technology Division is part of the FBI that actually does all the lawful intercepts and digital forensics for all of the FBI, specifically for our 56 field offices that we have throughout the country. And so far as encryption and technology, and before I go any further, these are everything you're going to hear me say. I'm not the director of the FBI, so this is not my official position. You're hearing my thoughts, my perceptions, based on the fact that I've been working internet governance, and I also work at the Operational Technology Division. So just if I could put that disclaimer out there, and trust me, you won't mistake me for the FBI director because he's about a foot taller than me and has a full head of hair. And encryption, and this is very, very timely because he actually just testified on the Hill last week about this very subject. And this was after a few times. He's actually testified a few times on Capitol Hill about this very, very issue. We in the FBI call it going dark. And because of encryption and other technologies and how they're advancing, going dark means the growing concern that law enforcement, not just the FBI and not just in the United States, but international law enforcement has with the inability to do those intercepts and digital forensics. And I think I can say that insofar as law enforcement is concerned, we're pretty agnostic about technology because the only thing we really want to do is our jobs and our mission, which is to capture criminals. So we've been around 100 years. It started out with the telegraphs and underwater cables or landlines and telephones. And as technology has progressed, we need to progress with that technology to ensure that we are fulfilling our mission. And our mission is public safety. So public safety actually cuts both ways, right? On the one hand, we have the OPM breach. I'm the victim of this crime. Insofar as that the security was not in place, the system was hacked. Now my information is God knows where. So the public safety activity is actually proactive. It's offensive, ensuring that we are protecting the public and doing things to do that. On the other hand, you have what we do as law enforcement, which is defensive, which is once criminal acts are committed, we need to find them. We need to trace down the criminal. How are we going to do that? And therefore, we need the ability to be able to pierce through that technology to accomplish the mission. And that really is the crux of the matter. So we can talk about a lot of different things with technology. Encryption is just one of them. But the idea is, how are we as society going to ensure that we can perform the mission of public safety, which is what law enforcement is designed to do? So it really even goes beyond law enforcement. It goes beyond what we do every day, and it really is a question for society to answer. Do you want to have a society in which there's norms and regulations and public safety officials, not just even law enforcement, there's a lot of civil officials as well, can perform their mission? And if they can't, then we're at a different space. We're at a different question. What is going to happen, and how are we going to ensure that the norms and regulations of society continue? And if they don't, are people going to be ready for those consequences? Because we're really all in it together. And the idea that we're pitting law enforcement against technologists or encryption really isn't what it all boils down to. And like I said, a lot of times people have misconstrued what the director has said insofar as we want a back door, we want special keys, and that really is not the case at all. The case is when we have a lawful order, and that's what this all is about, lawful orders. We only do this by going through a court process. When you have a legal order, how do we get that information that we are legally entitled to based on an investigation? And we are not the ones who are supposed to come up with a solution or prescribe technology. That's not what we do. We're not the experts on that. We need the experts to do that. And I think that is going to be something that's very important. And I think some people are asking for us to come up with a solution, but I don't think that would be a wise move insofar as that, since we're not the experts, I'm sure there's something that we may come up with that may not be the best solution because it just might be very parochial insofar as how we look at things. So with this discussion, with encryption, I think we as law enforcement, when I say law enforcement, international law enforcement, are pretty open insofar as what solution we come at. But if our mission is to protect the public, if that mission is to be maintained, then we're going to have to find a way to work with encryption and still be able to do what we do. So I think that's all I have for an opening statement for now. So thank you.
All right, thank you. And last up, Mike Oyang is Director for National Security at Third Way, and she has previously been Chief of Staff for Representative Anna Eshoo and also staff on the Select Committee on Intelligence, where I imagine this comes up a little too.
It does. Thank you, John. We've heard about what the private sector does to secure the internet, and we've talked about some of the challenges there. And Bobby's talked a lot about what the government does to try and secure all of us, not just on the internet, but just generally. But one of the tensions that's inherent in this panel is what happens when government is the entity that is trying to get the unauthorized access. And it's not just about Bobby and the FBI. There's a whole other set of three-letter agencies that we've seen press account after press account of that have been trying to get, or successfully gotten, access, unbeknownst to the companies and unbeknownst to their users, of data that we didn't know. So I think everyone would agree that we want government to be in a role where they can help secure all of us. I don't think, as technology has evolved, we've come to terms both in this country and internationally about what the right role is for government in terms of their access to that information. What should the rules of the road be? And what should the rules of the road be in a world where the government is both the protector, the victim, and the person who is trying to get access in ways that they may not want someone to know about. And I think that's really the challenge here. I don't think that we've had a good conversation in this country between these 3 points of view in terms of what the government wants. I'm very sympathetic to the FBI's concern that they are not going to be able to see when bad guys communicate with each other. And as someone who worked closely with people in Boston, you look at the Boston Marathon bombings, you look at what happened on 9/11, you look at terrorist plots happening throughout this country, there are things that I want the government to be able to stop. But I think the question is, when can the government have access to them? What kind of level of suspicion should they have before they can access? How big a pool of information do they get to build in order to find the information that they are looking for? And if people think that they are acting in a way that is too broad, and the market response is that they are going to provide everyone with encryption that keeps all unauthorized people who are trying to access the information, not just the government, is that okay? Because any type of access that's provided to the government, given the number of adversaries, not just on the criminal side, but from other nation states, given any potential access that could be out there, someone else will find a way to abuse it. Even if you were able to create access that the government could have to data, you would have to be able to trust that the person that the government gave that access to would not take that access and take that information straight to the Chinese and the Russians with everything that we know about how the government conducts the kind of national security surveillance that it needs. I don't know that we are in a position where you can honestly say, if, they say, I think it's Benjamin Franklin said that two men can hold a secret if one of them is dead. Can you honestly say that if you provide access to something that's available only to authorized users, that information won't get out there? And what does that mean if we are not in a place where we can have privacy?
All right, thank you. Well, let's see if we can drill down and get a little bit more specific. And I'm gonna start with you, Nick. This room is probably a little savvier. Most people outside this room tend to think if you're in your living room and the windows are drawn, what you do on the internet completely opaque to everyone, right? Let's imagine I am at home. My windows are drawn. I'm gonna do a little online banking. Maybe per Eric's trial, I'm gonna do a little searching on HIV, and I'm worried about my own health, and maybe check a little email. As I do those things, what am I exposing, and to whom am I exposing?
Yeah. Well, it's lots. So obviously, it's a kind of a setup. But if you are browsing the internet, you're leaving a digital trail through hundreds of different organizations in different jurisdictions. And one of the things that I mentioned earlier, HTTPS, is one of many tools that are used to help secure different parts of the internet. And as we know, the internet architecture is extremely complex and interrelated pieces, and some of them are encrypted, some of them are not, some of them have what the famous catchword of metadata that we're so happy to talk about. But there is metadata. There are various different identifying pieces of information that fly around. So to be more specific, if you are browsing on your web browser and you're going to a bank's site, what really flows over the internet, right? That's sort of the easiest first question. So on a technical sense, your web browser does a DNS query. So www.bank.com, and it asks various domain name servers, the phone book of the internet, translate names into numbers, and you get IP addresses. DNS servers, typically you'll be set up with one that's at your ISP, so your internet service provider will know and have a record of which websites you're going to. And potentially, if they don't have the record, then they will go upstream to another DNS service, such as the DNS administrator for this website. So these requests are unencrypted and fully go over the internet and over, first of all, your local network, and if you're connected to a cable network, every request inside of your local neighborhood, if you're say you use Comcast or Cox or something like that, is broadcast, and every single person in your neighborhood can tell that you are doing these sort of things. And so this is just the DNS. And so once you get your address, you connect to that web server, the IP address that you're connecting to, and establish a TCP circuit, meaning you send a hello to them, they send a hello back, and you confirm that this is an actual endpoint that you want to connect to. And what SSL does, HTTPS, almost all banking sites have the little lock icon, and the website starts with HTTPS. That means that it's encrypted, and it's encrypted with TLS, which is the kind of most popular protocol for encrypting things online. And what does that give you, really? Well, it gives you privacy and authentication from your computer to that computer that says that that the DNS has said is your bank. So everything between you and the bank is scrambled, and nobody listening along the line will know what the content of that data is. But very clearly in the headers, the internet headers, you do have a to and a from. So what you're protected from is from someone reading the actual information that you're typing into your bank, whether it's your password or your transaction history. But between you and the bank's website, it's encrypted. What it doesn't protect you is from what happens inside the bank's infrastructure. So you're connected from point to point from your browser to the website, and it's protected, but the metadata is there and visible to anybody who controls any hop along the way. And once it gets to your bank, it usually hits a piece of machinery called a load balancer, and behind that there's a set of other computers called a database. Databases are some application servers, various other computers that are connected together. If your bank is a traditional bank, they have that in a data center somewhere, and it's all locked down. Potentially it could be on the cloud, which means it's on some rented piece of hardware somewhere else. Here in Ashburn, there are quite a few computers that people use. AWS, Amazon's data centers are there, and it's one of the more popular places. A lot of the times your data is going to go there, but once it passes the first machine, there's no guarantee that anything is encrypted. So I guess in a practical sense, yeah, you're sitting at home, you have your browser in an incognito mode, but anybody on any part of these networks and, say, computers along the way who may have pieces of hardware installed in them as backdoors, or, if it's manufactured in a place where there's a piece of hardware in it that is not trusted, they can read who you're talking to, when you're talking to them, and how much data you're sending. And then potentially once it reaches the bank, stuff happens behind the scenes.
Okay, so let me see. We should also say, SSL there are whole movements, right, to expand use of SSL as a solution.
Yeah, and that's what I mentioned before, universal SSL.
So what I've just heard is my ISP, other ISPs, even my neighbors get some information even with SSL about who I'm talking to, and I've also with SSL, and I've also heard we need to come back to the what happens on the other side when it's unencrypted. But before we get there, I want to does it matter that my neighbors and these other ISPs, can you learn anything important simply by observing those things from the DNS lookup and from the header information if the payload is encrypted?
Well, absolutely. If you're, as Eric was describing, Googling different things, going to different websites, someone can find out and potentially make a profile on what you're doing. That doesn't necessarily say who you are, but depending on who the person is, they can make assumptions about what websites you're going to, when you're doing it, and from a law enforcement perspective, it can help establish, say, digital trails, digital fingerprints of something that you're doing. If you've been investigated and your ISP is tracking this, then they can go back and say, okay, yes, this person did visit this site that is tied to this crime.
Okay. Excellent. I got a great CS professor here on my left who I may bring in. So rising SSL is one of the things we are seeing changing, and we're seeing that solve some problems, but it leaves some holes.
I've got to be clear that the content is protected with SSL, and that's a very, very important thing. The metadata less so, and you can derive a lot from metadata, but SSL does protect your content.
Are there other things that are happening right now that are important in terms of trends towards protecting information and new ways to do it?
And this is definitely not knocking Cloudflare, because I was one of the first customers.
Sure.
And in fact, again, this is sort of the shade of gray. One of the greatest things they came out with was the SSL, because basically Cloudflare sits in front of my website. And I have had, typically after something like this, everyone, oh, what's this burger guy doing? Standardstrack.com, also standardstrack.org. Got to use those .orgs out there. One of the problems is Cloudflare is lying, right? Because it's not me, it's them as me, which is what I want. I want them to present themselves as me. There is another little issue with SSL, which is not necessarily an SSL issue, but or TLS. It's what we in the IETF call the magic pixie dust of key distribution. And the magic pixie dust is in the old, before public key cryptography, the only way we could do stuff encrypted was we had to share a secret. I had to give you a secret, tell you, I'm going to use this password, you can think of it, that will encrypt this software. And only someone with that password or a heck of a lot of computing power could ever, unencrypt the information. And as you can imagine, that's great if I'm going to, go with John, or you get one of my cards. On the back of my card, it's got my PGP public key. But what do you do when you're going to your bank? The bank's not going to have a million relationships and say, here's our little secret, and by the way, please don't tell anyone. So we developed this thing called public key cryptography, a lot of neat mathematics such that like Symantec can go to Bank of America and issue them a certificate that Bank of America can then issue certificates for their servers. And that it's Bank of America because Bank of America says so, but who's this Bank of America dude? Oh, well, Symantec says so, and I trust Symantec. Now, how do I trust Symantec? Is because when you get your browser from Mozilla, your operating system from Apple, Internet Explorer, it basically comes preloaded with Symantec and U.S. Department of Defense and 300 other of your most favorite people that you trust, like Chunghwa Telecom. And one of the problems we have now that we are addressing with a technology called pinning, but basically, if I go to my bank and I see that it's signed by GeoTrust, that's Symantec, I trust them, all right, that's my bank. But if one day my bank is signed by Chunghwa Telecom, my browser is going to say, oh, Chunghwa Telecom, that's somebody I trust, and it's signed, so hey, it's good, even though it's not. This technology, again, was a theoretical, except in the intelligence community, where it may or may not have been used, up until the day that Lenovo did it. And that's when, again, it hit everybody, because they were in there saying, oh, you're trying to we're going to improve the experience of our customers by sitting in the middle, lying with a trusted issuer. That issuer is no longer trusted. So from a policy, so there's some technologies that we're working on of improving that. From a policy perspective, one of the questions you need to ask yourself is, am I going to put my trust in people, or am I going to put my trust in technology? Now, of course, ultimately, you need to have your trust in people because technology can do some boneheaded things. But when it comes to privacy, right now, our trust model is we trust the government's going to go to a court to get permission to do whatever they need to do. And this has worked. And in the United States, no matter how much we want to whine, it actually has worked pretty well. Again, if you look at my introduction there, the most advanced technologically and most liberal country and one of the richest countries in the world democratically elected Hitler. And then the government went south from there. And all of their structures that were based in trust continued to be worked on trust, but the trust was the wrong kind. And all of a sudden, all their citizens were exposed. and a lot of them were murdered. I'd rather that we can come up with technological solutions that can provide access when needed. We took General Alexander's gauntlet, and we think we have an approach, but one of the downsides is the search has to be auditable, which would be okay for the FBI because they've gone and got their subpoena, not okay for the intelligence community. So that's still an open research problem.
I'm dying to take that in 100 directions, but and I haven't yet been able to bring in two more great speakers, so I can't do that yet. But a couple, we'll tee up things that are coming. I mean, among the things I just heard, there were systems built that created security, and some of the players may not have had incentives to use them as was expected, which will be coming up as we get to policy, and certainly a Lenovo case. And even more generally, holes are shifting, right? We're plugging holes and creating others for the non-engineers who want to pull something out of that. This is complicated. This is what an engineering professor who talks to policymakers just learns to translate. I have no ideas of my own. Yeah. So lots of places to go with that, but I'd love to bring in a perspective of those who have to think of this from an intelligence, or in this case, a law enforcement perspective. You've heard of. We've just talked about a couple of developments that are interesting and complicated, such as the rise of SSL. We could be talking about a bunch more. You said, you used the phrase going dark, which much in discussion. I'd love to push a little harder on that. And, when things went from telegraph to telephone, also change means new things happen. When you say going dark, could you be more specific about what you're losing, and maybe are you gaining anything too? How are these changes in technology really affecting how the FBI and its abilities?
Well, I think from the security aspect of it, we want our own communications to be secure. So we're relying on private industry, and that's what we're using with our own customized tools as well. But obviously, we are gaining. The better the encryption, the better the security, we as law enforcement gain. Going dark actually is a program that was started by the FBI several years ago, and now it's one of the director's top initiatives. And as technology is advancing, it's becoming increasingly difficult to be able to do intercepts, to be able to do digital forensics. And that presents a problem to us because as the FBI, are already resource strapped, and we're actually pretty lucky insofar as a law enforcement agency because we do have the most resources, we're the best funded. But what happens to the state and locals who don't have a cyber squad, who don't have digital forensics? What do they do? And we do help them as law enforcement or as the FBI. So what it means is that as this technology is advancing and we don't have solutions for it, we don't have the ability to act as quickly and as efficiently as we need to in response to a terrorist threat, kidnapping, a pedophile, a murderer, a bank robbery, you name whatever the crime is. And every time you're losing time, or even worse, the actual inability to solve a crime, then that presents a real danger. So with all of these advancements, in many different fora, not just with encryption, but there's lots of different advancements in technology that we are having to deal with what we call data at rest, which is stored data, and data in motion, which is intercepts. It presents a real challenge to us, and if we have to drill down and do the onesies and twosies solutions to each piece of technology as it comes out, and devote massive amounts of resources to one case, that means you're taking away from other cases that need to be worked on as well. And we're going to have to start prioritizing where we already are. And that's at the detriment to other cases and other issues that we need to address in total. So for Going Dark, there are significant issues and problems and challenges that we need to address, and it needs to be an enterprise solution, not a onesies and twosies solution. And even people within law enforcement, they're very used to saying that even if they can't get to something, oh, we'll work around it and don't worry and forget that company or forget this technology, there's another. But now the odds are really working against us and it's presenting a real danger. So when we talk about Going Dark, that's what we're referring to.
Yeah, please.
I find it really interesting, having worked on drafting laws that help govern the way that government looks at information, the presumption in government that technology will bend to the legal frameworks. And I think it's a real challenge here that the idea is that technology somehow must accommodate the FBI's mission. That the FBI has a mission, that they have a court order, and they should be able to get the information because of that court order. But as John pointed out, technology evolves. And actually, if you look at the kind of information that the FBI, not just the FBI, but the government writ large has access to, in terms of the metadata, in terms of the people who don't put up their privacy settings, who put things on Twitter, who, whose data passes through all these different points in the chain, all of which have varying degrees of security. Actually, the government has access to far more data about individuals in the last 20 years than they ever did in a period prior to that. It used to be if two people had a conversation with each other, the government had no way of measuring that conversation. But now if you send an email to someone else, the government's ability to collect domestically the metadata, the to from information, the routing of that information, perhaps even the subject. There's a huge amount of information that the government can build in terms of its persistent ability to look at people and to be able to say, we can build a pattern of life just off of metadata, not even off of content. So the government may have less information than it used to have, but it still has tremendously more information than it ever did before. And in some ways, it's a question of how well is the government resourcing itself to be as efficient as possible with the information that it does have, rather than how can we make sure we still have access to everything. In the days after 9/11, as the government started to tell people, if you see something, say something, and you had huge numbers of tips flowing in, they were flooded by information that they couldn't use, by false leads that sent agents down rabbit holes. The question is, how can the government be better at discriminating to identify the information that it actually needs, as opposed to pulling in everything just in case they might figure out later that they need it?
Bobby respond, and then Eric.
Sure. If I was in, I don't know what the implication was, but I don't think the idea is to vacuum clean or vacuum off metadata. What we're referring to is very specific cases where we have very specific needs, whether it's based on a telephone call or a device. So I agree with you. We don't want to suck up metadata because that was a big problem with lots of tips. And okay, well, we have all the information and then we're responsible. We have to analyze it. We have to go down those rabbit holes if they're false leads. I remember sitting on the Washington, D.C. sniper case. I've sat on, the Boston bombing, hotlines and cases and all of that. So we absolutely don't want to do that. And I don't think it's a question of bending towards, the FBI wants and well, let me rephrase that. I'm trying to phrase it in a way that I think we're trying to be very specific or very tactical and very clear that when there are very specific issues and technologies where that difference leads to the criminal, then that is the information that we would need to accomplish the job. So I'm with you insofar as not vacuuming in data that we may or may not need, or requiring laws or changing laws that would kind of advance that theory. But we're already seeing it, it's happening. And it's going to happen in greater numbers if we are at a disadvantage and the criminals are at an advantage. So that's the real message, not, bending things or trying to get more information than we need. We don't want that. We don't. We just want to be able to, if there's a crime being committed, we just need the information so we can solve the crime. And I think it's it's a very complicated issue insofar as once you start involving technology. But it does boil down to, that basic principle. And, obviously, we have to be better. Every agency could be better at resource allocation and stuff like that. But that isn't one of the problems that we're having now.
And one of the questions we have to ask ourselves, is the internet or electronic communication different or the same? So, for example, the FBI could always ask for records of who is sending a letter to whom. When I was young, a letter cost 8 cents and took about a week to get from here to there, and you had to think about it, you had to write it. So I remember at summer camp, I had to write a letter once a week home, really, and I almost did. My son is out of the country, and I Skype with him almost every day. So is the internet different? Yes, because the volume of communication has gone up dramatically. The cost, and that part of that's because the cost to me of doing it has dropped dramatically. It also means the cost of collecting and archiving has gone down dramatically. But then we ask ourselves, yeah, but when we sent a letter, we had very strict expectations of what was inside the envelope was private. And people more rabid than the library people were the post office people. When the police would come to them and say, we want to look inside the letter, it's like, where's your subpoena, over my dead body. Just like the library people don't want to give out their records. Well, but the flip side is, can you show me the envelope? Yeah, sure, here it is. There's no expectation of privacy. So is that different? The economics might make it different. One of the things I've been on the record for saying over the past few years is, do I really mind that the NSA could crack TLS for me? Not in general, not a backdoor thing, but I'm just saying brute force attack. Probably not, because it's going to cost so much. They're really only going to use it for the real terrorism case. And does that mean that the Chinese can do it too? Yes. But again, they're going to be doing it for the heavy, either their internal security or, with trying to get their goals, which is probably not looking at me. Do I want everybody to have everything on that? Probably not.
Yeah, and I think something that you brought up, which is interesting, is the two arenas that data is important, data at rest and data in transit. And something that must be stated here is these are two very, very different problems, technologically speaking. Data in transit, computer scientists have talked about this for a while and theorized you can protect data between 2 points and up to a calculatable amount. Whether people like to say the heat death of the universe is how secure you can send data from one point to the other. And as Eric, as you mentioned earlier, the key management problem is the actual really difficult problem when securing data. You can break data in transit if you can find out where the keys are, which are at the endpoints from either point, from one point to the other. So data at rest and the management of data, this is a problem that computer scientists haven't solved with the magic of public key cryptography. It's really, if you have two people communicating with each other, they have a key, and that key is located on a specific place. So when you talk about having access to data in transit or data communicating between one person and another, that's a very different question than data at rest at an endpoint. And mathematically, it's different as well. If you do have an endpoint, a computer, you do have a key. And these 2 points need to be, I guess, distinguished.
So again, would love to play engineer and jump in, but I've got to move along and ask a really hard policy question. What I've heard, for example, that even great security hasn't plugged the things that are exposed in control traffic, but you can do really well with the data in motion, except what's going on at the end systems. Okay, and I've heard that you would like to be able to get at that data when legally authorized for something important, but you don't want to specify how. Or so, are there policies and laws that we are discussing that can move that needle, that can solve his problem. There's bills being discussed in both the House and actually maybe you can tell us what's being discussed and the state of it, and then tell us how that would affect the issues we're discussing here and how.
So there's not actually a current proposal on policy to change the policies on encryption. Congress just finished debating in the last month a change to a surveillance technology that Eric mentioned, Section 215 of the Patriot Act. Previously, Section 215 had allowed the government, or under that authority, the government had collected all the metadata on everyone in the United States communicating domestically on a landline phone. As some people say, they were not building a haystack, they were creating a government monopoly on hay for that category of information. So when we're talking about bulk collection, it has actually been technologically possible for the government to hoover up everything in certain categories for some time. The Congress said, we don't want the government holding that data. You can leave that data in the hands of the telecommunications companies who have to keep it for their own purposes. The government can come get the pieces of that they need when they need it with appropriate authorization. So that's actually a fairly big change in the way that we govern that, trying to say to the government, look, you can take what you need when you need it to try and solve Bobby's problem on metadata. There are other programs under which the government is authorized to collect content data, specifically content data that is where one end of it is outside the United States. Content data where your emails, for example, they're between two people inside the United States, the government has to get a warrant. For information where one end is outside the United States, you're emailing with your kid at summer camp who happens to be outside the United States. The government doesn't know it's actually an American citizen. That information is not actually protected by the Constitution because they're focusing on the end outside the United States. And that law and that framework will be considered for renewal in 2017. It will expire, and so Congress will have an opportunity to revisit the protections around that and make changes, because that is actually one of the programs that Edward Snowden revealed some court decisions about. Government has subsequently declassified those decisions, and that the public had a very strong reaction to, because in this day and age, given internet communications, most people have some kind of communication with someone outside the United States or some entity outside the United States. So knowing that those communications are not protected is very troubling to a lot of people, because it's not just the metadata there, it's the content. There's another proposal that's pending in front of the government on cybersecurity information sharing, which would allow companies to share freely with the government information related to cybersecurity threats. But the term cybersecurity threat is actually defined very loosely. So the question is how will the government read that information about cybersecurity threats to be able to gather information from those companies? Or will those companies be able to share large quantities of information with the government, protected from liability from people who might say, look, you didn't have the appropriate constitutionally protected checks and balances around this information before you sent it over? That cybersecurity legislation may move this Congress sometime before the end of the year. They've tried to move it a couple times, but it's been blocked. And the challenge with that legislation is that I don't think people really know what it means. And it could be a way for companies to share really important threat information to help the government stop cybersecurity threats, or it could be a fig leaf for the NSA to be able to do what nobody wants them to do, which is get everything from everyone. Until we figure out what those definitions mean, I think that the interpretation of this law is a real question mark. And given what we've seen about how the NSA has interpreted laws previously to suck in large quantities of data, I think that people should be very concerned about exactly how the government is reading the statute that Congress is considering.
Just a quick one, because we could spend a whole panel on it, but there is a Georgetown program. Just Google S2ERC and Cyber ISE, CYBER ISE. And there's a lot of work going on because there's technology issues, how to share the information. There are these policy issues because really you can help a lot by sharing information, but we want to have it be the information that we want to have shared. No, by the way, a lot of people are like, oh my goodness, they're going to be sharing my email address and who I'm talking with. No, it's mostly what's the IP address of the botnet command and control server in Romania. It's almost typically not personally identifiable stuff. But you're right, the way the current draft legislation, it's getting better and better each time, but it's still not quite there. And frankly, my personal concern is not so much sharing with the government, but this is a way of companies to collude and say, oh, I've been breached. Here's my order book for the ones that I don't want you to bid on. And oh, you're giving me who you're bidding. Okay, good, right. We're good. So, there's a lot of abuse that can go on under that rubric.
Right. Or, it could be if a company knows that its cybersecurity practices are lax, it could share that information with the government. And then if a downstream user is negatively affected by a cyber breach, they could say, I don't have any liability here because I've shared that information with the government, so you can't sue me for anything. So there are a lot of implications to this law that I think people haven't really thought through.
I will. What if the allowed and compelled to turn over information are quite different, and also if it's encrypted per the going dark comment, are they required to unencrypt it? And then if so, what if they don't hold the keys? Are those things at all in debate, or is that not addressed yet?
So the issue of whether or not, say, for example, the government comes to Apple and says, I need this information on this iPhone 6, and Apple says, I don't hold the encryption keys to that. Here's what I have, and it's encrypted. So I've complied with the law, but I've given you something that is not usable from a government perspective. One of the challenges on this, and this goes back to a legal concept called the third-party doctrine, the idea that the individual, me, who's sharing the information with a third party, Google, Apple, doesn't have as much, there's not as much protection for the company as there would be for me. The way the government would have to do that is they would have to come to me with a warrant and say, you have to turn over your papers and effects, what you've actually seen. There isn't a process in any of the current legislation that says to the companies, you actually have to be able to turn it over to us in a useful fashion.
Just to give you warning, if anyone, while the last comments in response are coming, if you want to think about your questions, because after people respond, I will open the floor to questions.
I was going to say the current law we have is called CALEA, the Communications Act, Law Enforcement Assistance Act. I'm sorry.
Communications Assistance to Law Enforcement Act.
Yes, CALEA. Sorry,
yeah.
Should know that like the back of my head.
Yeah,
Yeah, so it came out in 1994, but it specifically does not include encryption. The other thing that we don't have in the United States is data retention laws. Europe, what's that? Right, that's exactly right. It doesn't include wire or encryption, and it's only for data in motion, which is intercepts, and there are no laws for search or data retention laws in the United States. So there still are a lot of we would review them as loopholes. I don't know how other people would view them as, but that does impede certain investigations, especially now when you using the example, of Apple and the encryption. Yes, they can provide us the device or saying, here's the information, but if it's encrypted, we won't be able to use it, and then we're just kind of stuck at that point.
Shane, go.
Hi. Thank you all for your time. This has been a really
Shane,
interesting
who are you?
panel. Hi, I'm Shane Tews. I'm vice chair of today's events, and I just want to thank everybody for the time you're spending on this. But I have a question. I realize this is complicated from both sides, trying to keep your information private and then also trying to understand what's going on when you need to know that. And from a global perspective, what do we do about attribution when it comes to cybercrime? I mean, there are certain people that feel like we're actually in a cyber war as we speak, and we're never sure if we're dealing with the Chinese, the Russians, my next door neighbor. And so while we're trying to protect certain elements of information, attribution continues to be a huge problem. We're not sure it was the North Koreans that did the Sony attack. People like to believe it sometimes because it's more convenient. So any thoughts on that, and understanding there's technical problems there, there's legal problems there, there's potentially legislative issues we're going to get into. Thanks.
Well, since we have a project on that. But again, it's not towards the IC or law enforcement. What we were actually looking at was for enterprises. And this was one where technology, on the one hand, you're talking about, policymakers do stuff in a vacuum from technology, and technologists tend to do stuff in a vacuum from policy. And it is actually good to get the two to meet, because we were looking at how do we solve this problem, and our solution actually was the NSA solution. Well, we'll just collect everything and then go look when something bad happens. And then we realized we can't do that. And that's what got us thinking of how could we do sort of attribution for the rest of us. How can you find out, and it was just the metadata, the traffic flows, where did this stuff come through, including the fact that it, as Nick said, these go through many different systems. So like the attack on Estonia, you might have remembered when Russia kind of shut them down. The attack came from like Iowa. Well, it didn't really come from Iowa. It came from a bunch of owned machines in the United States. But, the Estonians could have just as easily said, wow, it looks like the U.S. has gotten mad at us. Well, we didn't get mad at them. Somebody else did. So it is a very, very difficult problem. It is something that's very important to get right, because there are a lot of people out there who say, taking down the Sony network, meaning I can't play on my PlayStation, that's an act of war, which might have some consequences. No one else wants to touch that with it.
I think one of the challenges on attribution is there are times where we may know who actually did it, but for reasons of security, we won't actually say, because being able to say, people say, well, how do you know that? And being able to prove that reveals too much about the ways in which we figure out who is actually doing what.
This is hard because they're humans. They're actually even, and there are newer technical tools we are playing that with, you do stronger authentication, you get a better idea of exactly what machine caused the problem. But who was in control of that machine is hard if the human at the other end made any one of countless.
Although that was one of the things we discovered, that's the way technologists think, is we want to see whose fingers are on the keyboard. Sometimes it's just as important to know that, well, we don't know who did it, but it didn't come from North Korea. That is a useful answer, whereas computer scientists tend to think in terms of who we got it, and we'll never be able to prove whose fingers are on there.
And sometimes we can.
I do have notes. I did want to start out with the structure of the panel. Mieki and Robert are sitting next to each other when it appears you don't want any oversight, and Robert says, give me more, and Nick is sitting over here saying, trust me about security when there really isn't any security, and we have to really be adults about it and get to the point say there is none. You know that when you go on board. So my notes were, I actually trained as a crime analyst and profiler. My background is to be predictive, not necessarily to mitigate, but to be predictive, and his job was to put officers where they needed to go. Robert, I'm disappointed that you haven't been predictive and addressed the elephant in the room here, which was the ICANN and the IANA transition that was on the earliest panel. IANA is largely behind a lot of these crimes going on with the release of the TLDs. Bloomberg.market was a case of that. That panel, that actually tracked down to Verizon as it works out.
Can I ask you to move to a question?
It was, well, we keep on making statements. We're looking at, and it was really points I wanted to make. We're talking about crimes being made when we have technologies that the government set into play a long time ago. Real question is, at what point do we sit down and say, we created the problem, we have to maybe go back and look at the problems and how we got to where we are today, rather than to throw more solutions on top of it?
You can legitimately answer that as a funded next generation internet person.
Okay, we take it that way. We have problems because we have systems in part that were wonderful for their time, and the times they haven't changed. And we do need to figure out how to make large transitions, and there are people working on that. I'll let it go.
Yeah, I think reimagining the way that computer security works is important, but it's also important to help put stopgaps in the problems that we currently have. So people using the internet having a little bit more security now by adding things that are proven to have positive effects, such as HTTPS. I think these are positive steps to go at the same time as research on next generation technologies.
That forces me to say I strongly agree we need incremental change. We need technology and policy to push it. We also have a group of people, of which I'm a part, which is looking at the next generation, and we have to get it right there. But I am the cautionary tale this morning session about how when was IPv6 decided as the solution that was just around the corner how many years ago? Even if we had the next solution today, it is not going to be in place and pervasive for a little while. So we have some problems to solve with today's internet.
I would also just like to take issue with the characterization that I don't believe in any oversight at all. I actually believe that the government should also have oversight.
Hi, well, I'm Laura Ballard. I'm from the State Department, and I've been working on a lot of comparative research in how oversight works in different countries. And I was wondering, Mieke and Bobby, too, if you could comment a little bit. I'm very intrigued by this Third Way project of yours. One of the things I've noticed is that a lot of countries, particularly in Europe, we can talk about France and Germany, they have foreign intelligence and then they have domestic intelligence. And domestic intelligence is separate from law enforcement. So some of the criticism we hear from the Germans is not that you're conducting intelligence, but that FBI combines intelligence and law enforcement under one roof. And that's what they consider dangerous, because they're seeing that intelligence has a very liberal ability to collect information, but a very limited ability to do something with it. So NSA is not arresting anyone. They're not stopping anyone at the airport. So that's what's making them nervous. And there was actually a RAND study done for DHS a few years ago exploring the possibility of a U.S. domestic intelligence agency. So I'm just kind of curious to hear your sort of thinking about encryption sort of layered on top of this discussion about what kinds of agencies are able to obtain information and for what purpose and how with specific reference to encryption. Because I think on the encryption thing, the needs and prerogatives of intelligence and law enforcement can be quite different. Thanks.
So I think that part of the challenge that the Europeans see, and we tend to conflate this, is they talk to us about our privacy rules, and they think that they have better privacy rules in some ways, and they're often talking about commercial privacy, which is more strict than our rules. There's a lot of sort of U.S. versus Europe tension happening right now because of their frustration about the accesses that the NSA has had to data, and frankly, some of it's disingenuous because a lot of the Europeans in their national security space rely heavily on information provided by the NSA to identify their own terrorist threats. The other thing is that, and I, as somebody who served on the Intelligence Committee, one of the things that's frustrating about the Europeans when they talk about American sort of American aggressiveness in the espionage space or in the surveillance space is that we actually have I would say, the most aggressive oversight of our intelligence gathering apparatuses of any democracy. And frankly, if you look at the non-democracies, certainly more aggressive than that. The number of people in Congress who have access to the intelligence programs, who look at them, the independent IGs, all of the things that we do, are much more intrusive into the ways that we do the intelligence business than most other countries who are complaining about what it is that we do. Some of what I think they're complaining about is actually a jealousy of American capability because we are so much better and so much broader in the surveillance space that it's much more ubiquitous for us than it is for them. That's frustrating, but I would match our oversight apparatus to theirs any day of the week. We have permanent staffs on those committees that are looking at these things all the time. The German legislative committee that meets about intelligence meets like once a quarter and has something like 8 people on it. We've got between the House and the Senate somewhere closer to 40. We've got just of the elected officials. There is a lot more oversight that happens on our end than their end from a comparative perspective. And I would say our legislators are better at bringing in different policy considerations into the debate, including when we talk about encryption, because they are also concerned about economic well-being. What does it mean for industry? What's the best solution here? So I think that that's part of the conversation that we are not having about US versus Europe.
And you were mentioning that the FBI is both a domestic intelligence agency and law enforcement agency. That was reviewed in 2001 after the 9/11 attacks. And, people with higher pay grades than I decided that it was going to stick together. There have been benefits to it because sometimes, a lot of times when we've seen with domestic terrorists, they are engaging in criminal acts. And we also saw with the 9/11 attacks that there was a lot of information that we were not, as a law enforcement agency, to receive from our domestic intelligence side of the house. And that proved to be very, very costly and very detrimental to national security. So there are a lot of times when having that marriage actually does work, but it is very complicated, it is very difficult, and there's a lot of policies and procedures in place to ensure that the line is not crossed or is not to be crossed when we separate those two functions.
Thank you. My name is Chip Sharp from Cisco Systems. And just a number of years ago in my previous job, I worked on CLIA in the late 90s and early 2000s in developing how we will support our customers on their CLIA obligations. But that's not actually what my comment is, but it's interesting to hear that term, hear that acronym again after a number of years, as it's still relevant and important. What I really wanted to just mention is this discussion today has been more about law enforcement versus, user data rights in a way, but also encryption from end to end. But what I wanted to address just quickly is the enterprise issues, and that is that a number of businesses and enterprises have strict regulations on what they have to do to monitor their data within their networks. A number of other enterprises, Cisco is one of them, that have to monitor their data networks to watch for things like botnets, intrusions, exfiltration, and other things. So the going dark issue is a problem for enterprise as well as for law enforcement in terms of being able to monitor networks and protect your internal data and information from attacks and exfiltration, from employees, really. So that's something that, we're struggling with. We have to address it, looking at it from the switch side, the router side, as well as the encryption side, and the clients. So if you have any thoughts on that aspect of this problem, I'd be interested in hearing it. Thank you.
We're low on time, but if anyone were, yeah, that's the last question.
Well, we can give
but
some-
I can make a comment.
We will give support.
I can make a comment. Yep. Absolutely, this is something that enterprise has to deal with as well. And as you mentioned, there's a lot of historical regulations around what you have to monitor inside your own network, and basically how the corporate network is designed. And there have been changes, and there will continue to be changes about what the borderline between the corporate infrastructure and the outer world is. We're seeing more and more of this with bring your own device. That's sort of the touchstone issue here, where people can use personal phones and devices as part of their corporate network and logging in via VPNs. And encryption is becoming more pervasive, and some of these challenges that enterprise has to face, they have to do by adapting to the changing environment. And I think that's a challenge for all enterprises at this stage. Corporate environments are changing, and it's something we have to consider as well.
Yeah, no, it's and it is one of those shades of gray, because I've been very involved. We've been involved with this, where an enterprise, like again, a bank, really, really, really wants its communication with its customers to be very, very, very secure, and it's required to record everything and keep it pretty much forever. And there are a bunch of hacks out there today, and there are a number of companies that made a lot of money because there are these hacks to basically present the very secure connection outside the enterprise and a very, by design, insecure connection on the inside. That will make a very interesting policy and technology thing, which you can always pour more research dollars into it, I would think.
Love to end with a shameless plug for more research dollars. I will also end, since Eric was great, nice enough to bring in this wonderful prop, which I also shed enough blood, sweat, and tears over. That if those who want to read more, the IEEE on risking it all, unlocking the back door to the nation's cybersecurity. I want to thank a wonderful panel for trying to get through these very hard issues in 90 minutes.
Thank you.